Boldwood presents A Spring Surprise for the Cornish Midwife, written by Jo Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. The view from Jess Kennedy's apartment, Puffin's Rest, which looked out across the harbour at Port Agnes, usually seemed to stretch on to infinity, or at least to the horizon far beyond the harbour walls. For once, though, February mists appeared to be shrouding the whole world in an invisibility cloak, making it much harder for Jess to drag herself out of the warmth of her bed. It would have been so easy to stay curled up under the covers. Luna, the once stray cat, who now undoubtedly ruled every inch of Puffin's Rest, had other ideas. Sinking her claws into Jess's shoulder, the only bit of her body apart from her head visible above the covers, the little cat reminded Jess in no uncertain terms that it was time for breakfast. "Okay, Luna, I get the picture." Jess pulled herself into a sitting position. There was no need for an alarm clock when she had a hungry cat. Maybe it was just as well she'd had the rude awakening. She was due in clinic in just over an hour's time, and the first patient on her list was Faith Baxter. It was one appointment she couldn't be late for, and she still had her blonde bed hair to tame. A hot shower and a happily fed cat later, or at least as happy as the notoriously hard-to-please Luna ever got, Jess was in one of the consultation rooms of the Port Agnes Midwifery Unit. She had a full day of antenatal appointments in clinic, but the next day she'd be out on home visits. Thankfully, the heavy snowfall that had made the winding country lanes in the Three Ports area almost impassable in January had now melted away. Snowdrops were now appearing at the base of some of the hedgerows, and Jess was looking forward to spending some time out and about. The past 6 months or so seemed to have been consumed by the assessment she'd gone through to become a foster carer. It had been a little over a month since the foster panel had recommended her for approval, and her social worker had told her they were looking at lining up her first placement any day now. She'd be taking planned placements for a week or so at a time, providing respite care that could fit around her job as a midwife. Anna, the manager of the midwifery unit and one of Jess's closest friends, had said they'd do whatever it took to make it work. As long as Jess could provide enough notice of when she'd have a placement, they could arrange agency cover for those times. There were 3 reasons she decided to do respite fostering rather than full-time, but she'd only admitted 2 of them to her social worker. Jess was the only person in the world who knew about the 3rd one. Every time her phone rang, Jess's skin prickled in anticipation that this might be the call she was waiting for. She couldn't wait to welcome a child into her home, but part of her was terrified too. The weight of responsibility of making a child who'd already been uprooted from the life they'd known feel comfortable in another strange place made her heart race, the same way it had when she'd been in that position herself. But she desperately wanted to do it, and do it well, which meant excitement and anxiety collided every time she thought she was finally getting the call. For now, though, she was still waiting. "Come in." She looked up to see Faith coming in, her patient's bump seeming to enter the room a good 10 seconds before the rest of her. She was at that stage of pregnancy where it was hard to get in and out of a chair without making a harumphing sound. "How you doing?" "I can't remember the last time I slept properly." Faith gave her a watery smile. "Everyone keeps telling me I should be using this time before the baby comes to get as much sleep as possible, but I've never found it harder to get a good night's sleep. It's been like this ever since I lost Archie." "Is that why you aren't sleeping?" With most patients, Jess would have assumed that the lack of sleep was down to the uncomfortable final weeks of pregnancy. But Faith had been through so much. The placenta had stopped working late on in her first pregnancy, and her son had been stillborn. Jess had given her as much support as possible throughout the pregnancy, agreeing with Anna that Faith needed more midwifery checkups than most patients, in addition to the extra monitoring appointments she had with her consultant. But it was always going to be hard reaching the stage where her first baby, Archie, had died. "I just keep picturing it happening again," Faith sighed. "I know I can't give birth here or at home because I'm too high risk, but being in the hospital just reminds me so much of losing Archie, Sometimes I just want to run away somewhere and hide until it's all over. I keep thinking that as long as I stay out of hospital somehow, there's no way the same thing can happen to Titus. It's by far the safest place if you or Titus need any help at all. You've got your consultant there with you too. Jess reached out to squeeze Faith's hand. There were some patients she became closer to by virtue of how much they needed her. Because the truth was, Jess needed to be needed, now more than ever. And Faith did need her. She'd told Jess about the reason she and her husband, Michael, had chosen the name Titus for their son. She'd said the reference to the name in the Bible was that Titus was a true son of faith. So it had seemed like the perfect choice to parents who so desperately wanted fate to allow them to keep their second child. Jess knew all about the power of second chances and the hope that came with them, but that always came hand in hand with fear too. When you'd been heartbroken once, there was no trying to pretend that it couldn't happen again. I just wish you were going to be there. Faith's eyes were almost pleading, and Jess decided it was time to impart something else she'd agreed with Anna. There were no guarantees, but it might help Faith to cope with the run-up to the birth. I spoke to my manager, and she's cleared it with a friend of hers who heads up the hospital maternity unit for me to be at the birth alongside Michael, if you'd like that. The hospital team will still be there, of course, and the only hitch will be if I'm already out on a home delivery when the call comes in. Otherwise, I should be able to be with you. Oh my God, really? Faith's face was transformed, and she suddenly looked 10 years younger, smiling as Jess nodded. I might actually be able to stop hiding my car keys to stop me heading for the hills when I go into labour if I know you're going to be there. I wouldn't miss it for the world, and I promise I'll be there if it's at all possible. What about the fostering? I don't want to cause any problems for you if you're going to get a placement. Faith's face had taken on a pinched look again, the slightest hurdle to her plans immediately sending her spiralling back downwards into fear. The paperwork takes a while. Jess didn't want to tell Faith why she wasn't ready to take on her first placement yet, but she'd ask her social worker to wait until after Faith's due date before she started taking referrals. There was no way she wanted to add any kind of guilt trip to the load Faith was already carrying. I know it's selfish of me, but I'm so glad it doesn't move quickly enough to take you away from me before the baby's born. Faith's shoulders seemed to slump with relief. What about the lovely Dexter? Will he still be involved? Faith raised an eyebrow. She'd teased Jess about how often she mentioned her social worker's name when she'd asked her for updates about how the assessment was going. Jess had shared some of the details of the process with Faith to try and put her at ease and make her checkups focused on something other than the loss of her baby. But she'd done her best to brush off any comments about Dexter. He'd been really kind and had taken the assessment, which had raked up a lot of Jess's past, at a pace that worked for her. But he disappeared out of her life the moment the panel had recommended her for approval. His job was done, and that was clearly all it had been to him. He hadn't even turned up for the celebratory drinks the other midwives had thrown for her, even though he'd said he would. He'd texted her a couple of times since, but she hadn't replied. She'd liked him, but she wasn't going to repeat the mistakes she had made in the past and form attachments to people who didn't have them to her. It was the unspoken third reason for why she'd chosen respite fostering. When she'd been asked why she'd chosen that option, she'd told Dexter that the first reason was that she didn't want to give up the midwifery job she loved, and the second was because she was completely untested as a foster carer and there was a chance she might fall flat on her face. The third reason was the biggest, though. Jess's heart had been shattered for the first time when she was 10 years old. When she'd finally decided to trust the whole of her patchwork heart to someone again, almost 20 years later, it had been ripped to pieces again. It was a miracle it was still beating at all. But she was never going to give the whole of her heart to anyone again because it wouldn't survive one more loss. He's working as a freelance social worker now, doing training and assessments, so he's not involved with supporting carers once they're approved. Jess shrugged. I've got a new social worker who said I should be able to take my first placement next month. Are you excited about it? I was so pleased when you told me about getting approved. I went straight home and told Michael what a great mum you're going to make. It seemed to be helping Faith to focus on something other than herself, and even if it was making Jess feel a bit awkward, She was all for doing whatever it took to lower her patients' stress levels, whatever the cost to her own. I won't be anyone's mum, but I want at least to be a good memory for the kids who stay with me when they think back on their childhoods later on. Jess tried to swallow down the lump which always seemed to settle in her throat when she thought back to her own childhood. I know what it feels like when these things are handled badly, and part of me is terrified that if I get it wrong, I'll be making it worse for a child who's already been through so much. They all deserve to feel like they're the centre of someone's world, and if I can help them to feel like that, even for a week at a time, I've achieved something worthwhile. You'll be brilliant at it, but you've already achieved so much that's worthwhile, and I couldn't have asked for a better midwife. I'm so glad the hospital has agreed you can be at my delivery, because I don't think I could do it without you. I'm really glad I'll be there too. But you've been so strong, you'll be absolutely fine with or without me. I guess we're both stronger than we realise then. Faith smiled, and Jess hoped she was right. She'd been let down so many times by so many people, and she couldn't bear the thought of being responsible for making another child feel that way. She'd do whatever it took to make sure it didn't happen. 2 days after her appointment with Faith, Jess had spent the early part of the afternoon on home visits. When she checked her phone after she'd finished with her last patient, there were 3 missed calls from Ella and a message asking Jess to call at the unit as soon as she could. Ella was the deputy manager of the midwifery unit and another of Jess's friends. Working in high-pressure situations together the way the team at the unit did meant that deep friendships had grown between the midwives, and they'd been through a lot together over the last few years. "What's up?" Jess's mind was racing, and she had everything crossed that Ella's calls had nothing to do with Anna or her pregnancy. Their friend, who was also head of the unit, was expecting twins after being told she might never have children, and it was turning out to be a challenging pregnancy. It meant they were all very protective of Anna and on high alert for any worrying signs that things might not be going according to plan. "Faith Baxter's gone missing." There was a definite note of panic in Ella's voice. "She's been really anxious since yesterday, apparently, and Michael just wanted to check that she hasn't been in touch with you." "Oh, God. I haven't heard from her since her last checkup the day before yesterday. I wouldn't say she was any more anxious than any other time I've seen her recently, but there was always a chance if she's gone into labour, or even thinks she has, that it would send her into fight or flight mode and push her in the wrong direction because of what happened last time. I just hope she's okay. Michael said she couldn't sleep last night, and she got up at about 4 a.m. He went down at 7, expecting to see her, but she wasn't there. She's not answering her phone, and he's tried all their family and friends." Ella gave a shuddering sigh. "The police and Coast Guard have already joined in the search, and there's a group heading off from the harbour in about 10 minutes. Her husband sounded so desperate on the phone." "Poor Michael, he must be terrified. I'll try ringing Faith too, just in case she's willing to pick up my call. Then I'm going to go down to the harbour and see what I can do to help." "Thanks, Jess. Just let me know if you hear anything." "Of course I will, and I know you'll do the same." Ending the call, Jess scrolled down to Faith's number, but when she tried ringing her, it went straight to voicemail. All she could do for now was to join in the search and pray that Faith just needed a bit of time on her own to get her head straight. She was desperately trying to believe that Faith wouldn't just disappear. There was no way she'd put her longed-for second son, her rainbow baby, at any sort of risk. Jess couldn't stop shivering, though. People could make crazy decisions when they were terrified. But the baby wouldn't wait for Faith to come to her senses, and Jess couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Almost 20 people had turned up by the time Jess got down to the harbour, and Ella's father, Jago, who owned and ran Mehenic's bakery on the harbour, was heading up the search party, splitting the volunteers into 4 separate groups. Jess's group was tasked with searching the cliff top on the left-hand side of the harbour wall, where the coastal path stretched for several miles, eventually leading down to the road that headed in the direction of Padstow. There was no beach at all on that side of the harbour, just a cliff with a sheer drop into the sea. The coastal path itself was about 20 feet from the edge of the cliff and could only be reached by a steep climb from the harbour side. There was just a handful of farmhouses dotted in the distance. It was a contrast to the centre of Port Agnes and the roads that led out from the other side of the harbour towards Port Cara, where rows of cottages clung to the hillside and the hustle and bustle of village life was evident even in the depths of winter. If Faith had wanted some space to clear her head without interruption and to breathe in the sea air, then she'd almost certainly have chosen the side of the harbour that Jess's group would be searching. "Do you think a heavily pregnant woman could actually make it up this way?" Ella's mum, Ruth, was breathing hard as she walked with Jess up to the highest point of the coastal path. At barely half an inch over 5 feet tall, Jess was used to people towering over her. But Ruth wasn't all that much taller, and they fell into an easy step, side by side. You'd be surprised what even a woman in labour can do with the right motivation. Let's face it, it's the only reason women manage to get through labour at all. Jess gave Ruth a half smile. "Are you okay? Walking up here is definitely enough to take your breath away." "Just realising how unfit I am," Ruth grimaced, her cheeks glowing with exertion. "I think Jaco put me in this group on purpose. I'm not complaining, though. I just hope we find Faith." "Me too." Jess pulled her phone out of her pocket again. There was still nothing from Faith, but there was another text from Dexter. She'd ignored the 2 he'd sent after he'd decided not to turn up to the wine bar. It was better if they called it quits on their burgeoning friendship now, because the fact it bothered her as much as it had that he hadn't turned up to her celebration drinks was a massive warning sign. Getting close to Dexter would be far too easy and far too painful when he let her down, and she couldn't take the risk. Not again. Message from Dexter. "Hi Jess, hope you're okay. Not sure if you got my other messages or voicemail. I just wanted to explain why I didn't make your celebration drinks. A lot has happened since I last saw you. Can you give me a ring when you get a minute, please? Thanks." Whatever the reason, it didn't matter, especially not when Faith was missing. It was almost a month ago now anyway, and she'd assumed he'd given up trying after the first 2 texts, at least until now. She might have told him how much she liked him if he'd turned up that night when her defences were down. Thank God he hadn't. They'd both had a narrow escape. Slipping her phone back into her pocket, she picked up the pace to catch up with Ruth again. The only call she wanted now was one to say that someone had found Faith. Jess knew only too well what it was like to feel like you were completely alone and that no one understood what you were going through. If Faith was feeling like that, they needed to find her fast. The nights drew in quickly at this time of year, and they'd been searching for almost 2 hours. The glorious sunset was lighting up the sky as Jess, Ruth, and the rest of their group made their way back down the steep path to the harbour. They'd walked for miles looking for Faith, and Jess's calves were aching from navigating the inclines and rutty patches on parts of the footpaths. Some of the other search parties were heading back down to the harbour too, heads hanging low because Faith was still missing. And beyond them, the lifeboat was being winched back into the station. At least there was one upside to that. Faith hadn't been discovered out at sea. But all the awful things that could have happened to her wouldn't be wiped out until she was found safe and well. "Thank you all so much for your efforts to find Faith so far." Jago stood on some upturned crates next to a pile of lobster pots on the side of the harbour. "Unfortunately, as you all know, we haven't been able to locate her yet. The police will be continuing their own search, and for those of you who are able to join in, I'll be organising another search for us tomorrow." A rumble of conversation went through the small crowd in front of Jago, with most agreeing to join the search again the next day, including Jess. She wasn't scheduled to be working, and there was no way she could sit around whilst Faith was still missing. There was always a strong sense of community in Port Agnes, but at times like this, Jess was all the more aware of it. When she transferred to the unit, not long after meeting her soon-to-be ex-husband at a mutual friend's party in Bristol, she'd fallen in love with Port Agnes almost as quickly as she convinced herself she'd fallen for Dom. "Do you want to come back to our place for something to eat?" Ruth turned to Jess as the crowd began to disperse. "Ella and Dan are coming over, as well as Anna and Bray, and we'd love to have you join us." "I don't want to make extra work for you." "Don't be daft. It feels more important than ever that we're all together at times like this." Ruth linked her arm through Jess's. "And you and Anna can help me persuade Ella that it would be a good idea to have a few fireworks at the end of the wedding." "A few?" Jess raised an eyebrow, enjoying the feel of Ruth leaning into her. Ella's mother might drive her daughter mad occasionally, trying to take over the plans for her wedding. But Jess would have given anything to have her own mother around. Ella had reunited with her childhood sweetheart, Dan, after coming home to Port Agnes following an ugly breakup. Jess's relationship history might be a mess, but it was nothing compared with what Ella had been through. She'd been jilted on the steps of a London registry office in full view of a crowd waiting for a celebrity wedding, and the whole thing had been recorded in a video that had gone viral. No one deserved a fairy tale ending more than Ella, so Jess was only too happy to tag along and help Ruth persuade her to have a few fireworks on her big day. Well, maybe more like a few £100 worth if I'm honest, Ruth laughed. I've only got one daughter and I just want to give her everything I can. She's lucky to have you, and I'll do my best to help you persuade her. I'm just going to nip back and feed Luna first and I'll be over. OK, my love. It'll take me at least half an hour to sort dinner anyway, so any time before 7:30 will be good with us. Can I bring anything? Just yourself, my love. See you in a bit. Ruth unhooked her arm from Jess's and gave her a quick wave, before heading back around the harbour towards Mahenick's bakery. Ella's parents had the knack of making all the midwives of the unit feel as if they were honorary members of the Mahenick family too, so Jess never felt she was encroaching. It also meant she wouldn't be in if Dom decided to pop round again. Ever since he'd been asked to give her a reference for fostering, he'd seemed to have accepted it as an invitation to be part of her life again. He kept suggesting that they give things another try, and no amount of her telling him that was never going to happen seemed to knock his confidence. He just seemed certain Jess would change her mind in time. In ordinary circumstances, she might have told him in the baldest possible terms that hell would freeze over first. But she was worried that Dom would contact her social worker at any time and stir up trouble if he wanted to. She wanted to have at least 1 or 2 fostering experiences under her belt before she gave Dom the opportunity to rock the boat. Being at the Mahenicks would mean she had someone else to share her worries about Faith with too. Trying to remember if she had a bottle of wine in the fridge, and wishing she hadn't already eaten 5 chocolates out of a box that a grateful patient had dropped off for her the day before, Jess turned in the opposite direction towards Puffin's Rest, where Luna was no doubt already waiting impatiently for dinner. Jess! She recognised Dexter's voice, even before she turned back to look in the direction the shout had come from. He was sprinting along the side of the harbour, despite still being fully kitted out in his lifeboat uniform, minus the safety helmet. He was tall and dark-haired, and always seemed to have a slight grazing of stubble. His hair was slightly scruffy in a way that might have been deliberately styled to look sexy if he'd been the type, which he so obviously wasn't. A fact that would only have added to his appeal if Jess wasn't completely off the idea of men altogether. Do you usually wear that when you're off duty? You look like Mr. September in that RNLI charity calendar. Jess couldn't quite believe the words had popped straight out of her mouth. Thank God she hadn't added that her calendar would permanently be turned to September if he really had been that month's poster boy. I thought I saw you coming down the coastal path as we came back in, and I didn't want to miss you. He was only a few feet in front of her now. I can drop the kit back off afterwards, but I wanted to make sure you'd got my messages. When you didn't answer the first couple of texts I sent, I wondered if you were trying to tell me something, and it was nothing more than I deserved after I stood you up. But I kept finding myself wanting to talk to you about everything that was going on, so I thought I'd give it another shot. Yes, sorry. I was going to reply when I got in. Even Jess wasn't sure whether she was lying or not, so it was no wonder Dexter had wrinkled his brow. She was trying not to read too much into him saying he'd been finding himself wanting to talk to her, especially when she'd felt exactly the same every time the nerves about fostering had started to overtake the excitement. But she hadn't been able to stop the warm feeling from flooding her body. She could act casual, though, even if she didn't feel it. Don't worry about not making the drinks thing. It wasn't like it was a firm arrangement, and it was ages ago now anyway. I know, but I really wanted to be there. He took a step forward, sounding as though he meant it. But something came up. It's okay, honestly. I know how busy you are. Jess gave him a half smile. Dexter had quit his full-time job as a social worker because of his stepson, Riley. The little boy's mother had died a couple of years earlier, and his biological father was struggling with parenting him alone, so Dexter had stepped in. Jess understood how low down Dexter's list of priorities meeting up with her would be, but when he hadn't turned up, it had still felt like a punch in the stomach. It's Riley's dad. He's gone from finding things tough to a complete relapse. He's drinking really heavily again and taking whatever drugs he can get his hands on. Dexter sighed. It all kicked off a few hours before we were supposed to meet up, when Connor didn't do school pickup as arranged. By the time I tracked him down, it was obvious he was in no fit state to look after Riley, and I can't imagine him being able to do that again any time soon either. I was ringing around everywhere, trying to get him into rehab, and there was no way I could leave Riley. By the time I had a chance to ring you, I knew you'd already be out having fun, so I wanted to wait until things had settled down a bit. Oh God, poor Riley. Jess's chest ached at the thought of what the little boy was going through. Like her, he'd lost his mum in a car crash, but at a much younger age than Jess had. And now it seemed as though his dad was failing him in almost exactly the same way as her own had. Thank God Riley had Dexter. He doesn't really understand what's going on, but he was upset because Connor had promised to take him to a petting zoo near Boscastle after school. I took him the day after, but he kept asking when his dad was going to be coming back, and it was so hard to know what to say. He's lucky to have you. Jess's fingers were itching to reach out and curl around Dexter's, but she told herself it was just a reflex action. It would have been stupid, and Dexter would probably have been horrified. It was probably that she just felt guilty at ignoring his texts when he could have done with someone to talk to. That was the only reason she wanted to reach out to him. It's going to be tough. I'm not under any illusions about that. I'm going to be responsible for Riley 24/7 for as long as it takes, and with my freelance work and volunteering with the lifeboat, it'll be full on. One of my sisters has got him for me now, but he needs the stability of being with me as much as possible when he's not in school. Dexter held her gaze. So I'm going to need all the friends I can get, and you can tell me if I got it totally wrong. But I felt like we really formed a connection during your assessment in a way that doesn't often happen. I genuinely want to stay friends with you, Jess, and I've been kicking myself for not taking the time to message you on the night we were supposed to meet. Although, for all I know, you might have been relieved that the social worker from your assessment wasn't still hanging around. I wasn't relieved. It was as close as Jess would get to admitting, even to herself, just how gutted she'd been when he hadn't turned up. But you're not going to have time to stay friends with anyone and everyone you help out in your job. I understand that. I really do. Jess had experienced the same thing as a midwife. The women she cared for often wanted her to stay a part of their lives, and sometimes she did. But most of the time she moved on. She had to, or she'd never be able to do her job. You aren't just anybody, Jess. Dexter was still looking straight at her. I miss talking to you. I suppose I'm going to need all the friends I can get when I start fostering too, especially someone as experienced as you. Jess fixed the smile on her face, ignoring the tightness in her chest that was warning her against taking a risk she'd promised to steer clear of. She should be worrying about Faith Baxter now, and poor little Riley. Nothing else mattered. Feeling as uneasy as she did about letting Dexter into her life made no sense. They were only ever going to be friends. It was just her fight or flight instinct kicking in, that was all. And every child who'd been in foster care would understand exactly how she felt. The first thing Jess did when she opened her eyes the next morning was to check her mobile phone, desperately hoping for a message to say that Faith had been found safe and well, or better still, that she'd returned to the family home of her own accord. Unfortunately, there was just an update from a Facebook group that had been set up, called Bring Faith Home, telling everyone who'd signed up that the search parties would be meeting at 9 a.m. at the harbour to restart the search. She still couldn't really imagine Faith doing anything crazy. Her overriding motivation from the first time she'd come to see Jess had been to protect her unborn child and for everything to be okay this time round. But there was no way of knowing how she'd react when she went into labour and the trauma of losing baby Archie came flooding back. Jess just hoped by the end of today, Faith would be home again and they could help her prepare for her baby's birth. According to Michael, every other avenue they'd investigated to try and find Faith had led to a dead end. None of her friends or family had heard from her, and she wasn't at any of the usual places she went to when she needed to clear her head. It was as if she'd disappeared, and every minute she was gone, there was more chance of her going into labour and ending up terrified and alone. Jess would do whatever it took to help get Faith home again. With a 9 o'clock meet-up to get to, she jumped into the shower and then grabbed a coffee and a slice of toast. If she was going to stick it out with the search party for as long as they continued to look for Faith, then she was going to need some energy. "See you later, Luna. I've left you a big bowl of food in the kitchen," Jess called out to the cat. It was stretched full length along the sofa, enjoying the morning sunshine and completely ignoring her owner. But despite Luna's nonchalance, as Jess put her key in the lock to open the front door, she could have sworn she heard a cat mewing. Except when she turned back round, Luna was still stretched out sleeping. "I'm definitely losing the plot," Jess was still muttering to herself as she pulled the door towards her. But if she hadn't been holding onto the handle, there was a good chance her legs would have given way beneath her. Because there, on the platform outside her front door, was a baby. Chapter 2. The baby lying on the platform outside Puffin's Rest was cradled in a wicker basket that wasn't really big enough, and one chubby pink leg was already sticking out from the bottom of the blanket. Jess seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. She had to hold it together, despite the fact that goose pimples were already breaking out all over her skin. There was no one else around, so for now the baby was relying on her, even if she was terrified of what she might see when she peeled the blanket back. As soon as Jess moved back the cover, it was immediately obvious to her that whoever had delivered him hadn't been a professional. The cord had been cut far too long, and had been clamped with the sort of clip meant for keeping a bag of open crisps fresh. Scooping up the baby boy, Jess's heart was galloping so quickly she wouldn't have been surprised if he could feel it too. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. I'll get you sorted out." Thankfully, despite the shock that was still making her hands shake, Jess seemed to have gone into some sort of autopilot, her midwifery instincts kicking in and taking over from the 100 or so other emotions reeling through her head. She had no idea what she was going to do about the baby, but one thing she could do was make sure he was kept safe, and the first step was to get him indoors in the warmth. She also knew that if the cord wasn't properly clamped, it could cause the baby to lose blood volume and risk infection, so she had to move quickly. Taking everything she needed out of her delivery bag, Jess cleaned the baby up, checking him over and clamping his cord the way it should have been done, all the time feeling almost as though she was watching herself from above. Once she dealt with the immediate emergency, the autopilot switched off, and all the blood seemed to rush from her head to her feet, making her dizzy. She wanted to pick up the poor little baby who was lying in the middle of her bed, completely oblivious to the fact that he'd been abandoned. But she wasn't going to do it while she felt as if she might keel over at any moment. Instead, she sat next to him on the bed, running a finger down his soft, downy cheek. "Where's your mummy, sweetheart?" Whispering the words to him, she stared at his face. There was something strangely familiar about it. She'd seen hundreds of newborns, but while some people thought they all looked the same, they never had to Jess. There was something she recognised about this little boy, and that could only mean one thing. He had to be Faith's son. She couldn't pinpoint exactly the resemblance with his mother, but it was the only thing that made sense. Why else would anyone leave their baby on Jess's doorstep? And she talked to Faith about how much she loved living at Puffin's Rest with its view of the harbour, so she knew where Jess lived. And why would it feel as if she already knew him otherwise? "Oh, God, poor Faith." Jess whispered the words, even though the baby had no idea what she was saying. She couldn't bear to imagine what his mother had been through, and what state she must have been in to leave her longed-for son behind. It was almost impossible to believe that Faith would leave her new baby even for a second, or risk infection by clamping the cord herself. She must have been so distraught that she was incapable of thinking straight, and Jess just hoped to God that Faith wouldn't do anything to put herself at risk, any more than giving birth alone already had. The trouble was, anything seemed possible given what she'd already done. If there was any chance that Titus could be taken away from his mother, even for a few days, because of a decision she'd made when she'd been out of her mind with worry, Jess didn't want to be a part of that. But she had to keep the baby safe above all else, like his mother clearly wanted when she left him outside her door. She just had to work out what the hell to do next, and there was only one person she could think of who might know. "Hey, I wasn't expecting a call, but it's lovely to hear from you." Dexter's voice was warm, and some of the tension immediately left Jess's spine. If anyone could sort this out, it was him. "I've just found a newborn baby on my doorstep." "And I've just won the lottery." When Jess didn't laugh, Dexter went quiet for a moment. "You're joking, right?" "No, although I can hardly believe it myself." She looked down at the baby who was cradled in her other arm, just to make sure it really was true. Dexter was right. This sort of thing didn't happen in real life. He didn't even know how close to the truth his comment was. Someone giving Jess a baby really would have been like winning the lottery. Dom had ended their marriage when they discovered she was infertile, and he'd blamed her for the reasons behind it. It was something she'd kept from Dexter during her fostering assessment, and she would never be a mother without an intervention even more miraculous than a lottery win. He's obviously only a few hours old, and it looks like a DIY delivery, but he seems perfectly healthy. He looks full-term, too, and Faith Baxter is the only patient I have at that stage. Do you really think he could be hers? It's the only reason I can imagine that anyone would leave a baby on my doorstep. Do you know if she was expecting a baby boy? Yes, but it's still almost impossible to believe she'd do this, although I struggle to understand how anyone could. Jess bit her lip as she looked down at the baby in her arms again. As a midwife, she knew better than anyone else that not every new mother felt that overwhelming rush of love the moment they looked into their baby's eyes. But for someone to be so desperate they'd abandon their baby was something she couldn't get her head round, especially not when, like Faith, they'd already lost so much. Jess could still feel an almost primeval tug on her soul when she looked down at this little boy who might well belong to a woman who'd already lost one baby. He didn't belong to Jess, though, and he never could, so she had to get him back to his mother as quickly as possible for both of their sakes. From some of the stuff Faith said, I could imagine her panicking and going into denial when she went into labour, but to give the baby up when he arrived, I would have bet she'd rather die. I don't know her. Dexter's tone was gentle. But I've known cases where a mother has left a much-wanted baby because they've convinced themselves that they're useless and can't keep the baby safe. Is there any chance Faith might feel like that? She was so terrified of another hospital birth ending up like the first one when her son Archie was stillborn. She wanted a home delivery to avoid all those comparisons, but the consultant thought it was too risky. Jess shivered. She couldn't help thinking she must have missed the signs and that she'd let Faith down in some way. I suppose it's possible that she took things into her own hands and that even after delivering the baby safely, she's still convinced he's at risk by staying with her. I just really hope that isn't what's driven her to this. There's a good chance the past trauma is at the bottom of all of this, and it might be making her act completely out of character. It could well be that Faith doesn't trust herself and she wanted to leave her baby with the one person she believes will keep him safe instead, her midwife. Oh, God. Jess had never been the sort of person who'd worried about looking after someone else's baby, even before she trained as a midwife. But now the child in her arms felt as fragile as glass. Someone, almost certainly Faith, had trusted her with the most precious thing in the world. Suddenly Jess could imagine exactly how it felt to be so terrified of not being up to the job that you consider giving up a baby because of just how much you loved it. What the hell am I supposed to do now? You're going to be fine, I promise, and whoever left the baby with you knew exactly what they were doing. Dexter had a lot more faith in Jess than she had in herself, but there was nothing new about that, and just the tone of his voice was every bit as reassuring as it had been during her assessment. I've already dropped Riley off at school, so I'll phone social services and the police and then I'll be straight over. Just sit tight and trust your instincts and your training. He couldn't be in better hands. Believe me, I'm not going anywhere. The warm glow was back, the same one Jess got every time Dexter paid her a compliment. She didn't want it to mean as much as it did because she hated the idea of relying on anyone's approval, but knowing that Dexter had faith in her had made a huge difference from the moment she'd started the fostering assessment. He's been pretty content so far, but he's starting to get a bit restless and he's going to need some milk soon. I'll grab some newborn formula, a couple of bottles and some other stuff you'll need on the way over. I'll be as quick as I can. Even after Dexter ended the call, Jess stayed rooted to the spot. This couldn't be happening. There might have been times when she'd wanted a baby more than anything else in the world, but she'd never in a million years envisaged it happening like this. Either way, she'd never be allowed to keep him, and nor should she. He belonged to Faith. But just for a moment or two, as she rocked him in her arms, she let herself imagine that he was hers and that she could keep him forever. She tried not to think about the extra hairline crack that would almost certainly appear on her heart when she handed him over. Knowing he'd be back with his mum would override any sense of loss that she had no justification to feel anyway. She was almost sure of it. Dexter knocked on the front door of the flat less than 30 minutes later. Jess had thought about calling Anna or Ella while she was waiting, but she didn't want to do anything until she'd spoken to him again first. She was sure her friends wouldn't want the baby to be removed from Faith's care any more than she did, but Dexter was the expert on how to play the situation so that there'd be the least risk possible of that happening. By the time he arrived, laden down with bottles and ready-made formula, the baby had just started to whimper. "Can you just hold him for a minute, please, while I sterilize the bottles and warm up his milk?" Jess didn't even wait for a response before handing the baby over, her arms shaking as she finally released her grip on him. Having Dexter there to share the responsibility was like a lead weight being lifted off her. "He's beautiful, and he feels like quite a good weight." Dexter rocked the baby like a pro as he gazed down at him. "I'd guess at close to 8 pounds, but I haven't actually weighed him yet." The truth was she'd barely been able to take her eyes off him. The sweep of dark lashes that rested on his cheeks when he closed his eyes, and the tiny rosebud mouth which pursed when he started to whimper. Could you tell how big Faith's baby was likely to be? At her last scan, a couple of weeks ago, they said the baby would be in the region of 7.5 to 8.5 pounds by the time she got to full term. Jess put the water on to boil. Sterilizing the bottles would be a bit of a makeshift operation, but before much longer the baby was going to be wailing for food, and she didn't think she'd be able to bear to listen to him really crying. He'd already been through so much in his short life. The least he deserved was a full belly. Everything's pointing to Faith being his mother, isn't it? At least, if that is the case, we know she safely delivered her baby and there isn't an even worse reason she's missing. Hopefully it's just a case of tracking her down and getting her the help she needs. I can't stand thinking about what she's been through, delivering him on her own like that, let alone what she's going through now. Jess shook her head. Do you think they'll give the baby to Michael while they wait for her to turn up? Not without proving the baby is definitely his and Faith's first. So what will happen to him? Jess put the bottles into the boiling water, a sudden urge to snatch the baby back from Dexter almost overwhelming her, despite her relief at his arrival. If she could only have the baby for a little while, she didn't want to miss a second of holding him close to her and letting him know he was loved and wanted. His mother could do that herself once she'd got the help she needed, but in the meantime, even if it was just for an hour or so, it was down to Jess. Faith had chosen her, after all. The police will start an investigation to find his mum, most likely an appeal in the news and online to try and persuade her to come forward. Dexter was still rocking the baby gently to and fro, and social services will look to place him with a foster carer in the meantime, once he's been seen at the hospital and they've made sure he's okay. Do you think they'll let me go to the hospital with him when he gets checked over? At least until his foster carer shows up? Tears burned at the back of Jess's eyes, knowing that Dexter would understand what she was about to say, even if it made no sense. I hate the thought of him being on his own, with no one there for him, and I know Faith would hate that too. The social worker will go with him, but given that you're a midwife and that you've almost certainly got a connection to his mother, there's a pretty good chance they'll be more than happy for you to go too. I hope so. Cutting the top off the carton of formula, Jess offered up a silent prayer that Dexter was right. She was all the tiny baby boy had for now, and there was no way she was going to let him down. Jess came out of the examination room with the baby in her arms and a paediatrician at her side, which was just as well, or she might have made a run for it. She'd already fallen in love with a little boy whose navy blue eyes seemed to search her face every time he opened them, even if she knew full well he couldn't focus on anything at this stage. The good news is he looks to be absolutely perfect thanks to the swift action taken on his cork clamping, and as Jess suspected, he's definitely brand new. The paediatrician, a jolly middle-aged woman with cheeks like ripe apples, laughed as she updated Dexter and the social worker from Children's Services on the baby's checkup. They'd been sitting waiting on the row of plastic chairs outside her consulting room, whilst Jess had been allowed in with the baby. "So I'm more than happy to release him into your care." "Thanks, Doctor, that's great." Madeline, the social worker who, up until his resignation, had been a close friend and colleague of Dexter's, returned the paediatrician's smile. "I think he was lucky he was left on Jess's doorstep by the sounds of things." "Yes, very lucky. Sorry, I've got to dash. I've got a clinic in 20 minutes, but you've got my details if you need me for anything." The doctor was already turning back towards her consulting room, and Jess was trying to prepare herself for Madeline saying it was time to hand the baby over. She'd never had lockjaw, but she imagined it must feel something like the rigidity she was currently experiencing in her arms, as though they might never come apart and allow her to hand the baby over. Faith had trusted her with her newborn son. That was the reason she was so desperate to keep hold of him. Nothing else made sense. She couldn't possibly have got this attached to the baby this quickly for any other reason. When she'd thought about fostering, what had worried her most was making sure that the children had a positive experience and felt wanted, even if they were only with her for a week. What hadn't kept her awake at night was just how attached she might get to the children and how hard it could be to say goodbye. Only a couple of hours of looking after Faith's baby had given her a whole new set of worries. "You really were a lucky boy to end up on Jess's doorstep." Madeline stood up and stroked the baby's cheek. "We can't just keep calling you the baby until we find out who your mummy is, though, can we?" "That's what I thought when I was talking to the doctor. At the very least, the poor little thing should have as a name, even if it's only temporary." At least Jess had always had that, and despite her father abandoning her, knowing who she was and where she came from had always been important to her. It was why she'd gone back to her maiden name of Kennedy so soon after splitting from Dom. "Have either of you got any ideas?" Dexter stood up too, his eyes meeting Jess's, and she couldn't help wondering if he could read what she was thinking. That being the one to choose the baby's name would make it even harder to let him go. "If we knew for sure he was Faith Baxter's baby, then I'd know exactly what to call him," Jess sighed. She's had the name Titus picked out ever since she found out she was expecting a boy. But I don't want to give him that name because of the tiny chance he isn't Faith's baby, and that needs to be her thing anyway, naming her son when they're back together. "If he'd been a girl, we could have called him Agnes," Madeline grinned. "Although it's hard to imagine calling a newborn that anyway, especially as it's my great-aunt's name." "What about Theodore? It means gift of God or something like that." Jess was trying to play it cool, but she knew exactly what it meant. She'd decided a long time ago if she ever had a son, she'd call him that, because it would mean she'd found a way around her infertility, and that really would have felt like a gift from God. And he could be called Theo or Teddy for short. "I think that really suits him." Madeline smiled again, and right on cue, the baby opened his eyes. "Me too. Hello, little Teddy." Dexter stroked the baby's head. "Welcome to the world." "Do you think I could have a photo of him before you take him?" Jess would only be torturing herself, but she still wanted a picture of Teddy in her arms. If this was the closest she ever got to being a mother, then she wanted to remember it. If he was Faith's son, and she needed a lot of help to come to terms with everything that had happened, there was no way of knowing when Jess would see Faith or the baby again, if at all. When she held him in her arms, it felt like he belonged there. If someone had asked her why, she wasn't sure she could have explained it. But there was something so achingly familiar about it, especially when she gazed down at him. Maybe it was because she'd imagined it so often that it felt like she'd held him countless times before, as if she already had thousands of memories of the little boy she'd only just met. "Actually, I've been talking to Dex and I wanted to run something by you." Madeline furrowed her brow. This is a big thing to ask, and I know you were only planning to do respite so you can keep on working. But I've spoken to my manager, and we both think you'd be the best person to keep Teddy until we find his mum. But it would mean you being off work full-time in the short term. You really want me to have him? Suddenly, Jess was struggling to speak and breathe at the same time. Her head was telling her to stop this now and let Teddy go before she got even more attached to him than she was already at risk of becoming. But her heart wanted to throw her arms around Madeline and agree to keep Teddy forever, if that's how long it took to find his mum. This was dangerous, she knew that. But when she looked at Dexter, he was already nodding. His mother chose to leave him with you, and we don't think that's a coincidence. He put his hand on her arm. The likelihood is that she'll be more willing to come forward if Teddy is with you, and it's our best chance of reuniting him with his mum. Not to mention that you're a midwife, and that makes you better qualified than anyone to look after a newborn. But, like Maddie said, it's a lot to ask of you, and I don't know if you'd be able to get the time off. That's if you even want to. I do, I definitely do. Jess already loved the solid feeling of Teddy's body in her arms, and even if she was setting herself up for agony further down the line, there was no way she was going to miss out on her chance to be a mum just for a little while.